In the summer of 1996, a sprawling 18-acre estate in Indianapolis, known as Fox Hollow Farm, held a terrifying secret. Behind its pristine facade and perfectly manicured lawns, something sinister lurked in the soil. It started with what looked like an ordinary piece of bone, partially buried near the swimming pool, then another, and another. As investigators began to dig, their worst fears were confirmed. Scattered across the property, hidden beneath leaves and dirt, were the remains of multiple human beings, skulls, vertebrae, ribs, all telling a story too horrific to imagine. The bones weren't ancient, they were recent, and they didn't belong to just one person. The peaceful suburban property had become a killer's dumping ground. What appeared to be a peaceful sanctuary for the wealthy Baumeister family was about to be exposed as something far more disturbing, a place where young men had vanished without a trace, their final moments spent on these very grounds. The question wasn't just how many victims there were, but how had this gone unnoticed for so long? Hey everyone, I'm Luna, and wow, what you just heard is honestly just the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases I've ever come across. For those of you joining us for the second time, welcome back to Crime Intelligence. And if this is your first time here, well, you've picked quite the episode to start with. I gotta tell you, when I first started researching this case, I could barely sleep. We're talking about a seemingly normal suburb in Indianapolis, the kind of place where people have backyard barbecues and kids play in swimming pools, but sometimes the scariest monsters are hiding in plain sight, aren't they? Before we go any deeper into this absolutely chilling story, I just want to say that what we're about to discuss involves some pretty heavy stuff. But I promise you, everything I'm about to share is real, verified, and, well, honestly, more terrifying than any horror movie I've ever watched. Herbert Richard Baumeister seemed like your typical suburban success story. Born and raised in Indianapolis, he was the oldest of 4 children, living what appeared to be the American dream. But you know how sometimes things aren't quite what they seem? Yeah, this is definitely one of those cases. Growing up, there were some, well, let's call them red flags. Herb had this weird habit of playing with dead animals he'd find, and his teachers noticed he was kind of different. But somehow, he managed to keep it together enough to graduate and even land a pretty decent job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. In 1971, he met Julie Runnels, and they got married. Had 3 kids together and everything. Picture this perfect suburban family. Mom, dad, kids, nice house. Herb even started his own business, a thrift store chain called Save-A-Lot. And let me tell you, it was actually doing really well. They lived in this gorgeous estate called Fox Hollow Farm in Westfield, which is this super nice suburb of Indianapolis. But here's the thing that gives me chills. While Herb was playing the role of successful businessman and family man during the day, he was living this whole other life that nobody knew about. He'd go to these gay bars in Indianapolis, right? And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, except, well, people who met him there started disappearing. The craziest part, his wife Julie and their kids had no idea, 0 clue. When they just saw this hardworking guy who sometimes acted a bit eccentric, but hey, don't all successful business people have their quirks? Man, if they only knew what was happening in their own backyard, literally. The Indianapolis Police Department first caught wind that something wasn't right back in 1992. So there was this guy, Roger Goodlet, who had completely vanished, gone without a trace. His friend went to the police and told them about this weird encounter Roger had with someone at a gay bar called Brothers. The thing is, Roger wasn't the only one. More and more reports started coming in about gay men disappearing. After being last seen at bars along Interstate 70, the missing men all had something in common. They were last spotted with this tall, well-dressed businessman type who called himself Brian Smart. Now here's where it gets really interesting. In 1993, this guy named Tony Harris had the scariest night of his life. He met someone at a bar who took him back to this huge house. The man tried to strangle him during what was supposed to be, an intimate encounter. Tony managed to escape and ran to the police, but get this. He was too scared to press charges at first, but Tony couldn't shake off what happened. A few years later, in 1995, he saw the same guy again and followed him. Wrote down his license plate and everything. That's when investigators finally had their first real lead. The car belonged to Herb Baumeister. Detective Mary Wilson was assigned to the case, and she started connecting the dots. All these missing persons reports, they all fit a pattern. The description of this mysterious Brian Smart, it matched Herb perfectly. But they had a problem. They needed more evidence. I mean, you can't just walk up to someone's house and accuse them of being a serial killer based on a license plate, right? The police tried to get a search warrant for Fox Hollow Farm, but they just didn't have enough proof. It was so frustrating for them because they just knew something wasn't right. But Herb, he just kept going about his business like nothing was wrong, probably thinking he was untouchable. As the investigation hit this roadblock, Detective Wilson knew she needed to try something different. She decided to approach Julie Baumeister, Herb's wife. At first, Julie was defensive of her husband. I mean, wouldn't you be? But something had been bothering her too. Their son had found something disturbing in their backyard, what looked like a human skull. When Julie confronted Herb about it, he had this weird explanation. He said it was just a medical skeleton his father had used in medical school. And Julie, well, she wanted to believe him. Who wouldn't want to believe their spouse? But deep down, something just felt off. As Detective Wilson kept talking with Julie, more strange details started coming out, like how Herb would spend hours landscaping late at night, or how he'd get super angry if anyone went into certain parts of the property. And then there were these unexplained absences, always coinciding with reports of missing men. Finally, in June 1996, Julie agreed to help the police. While Herb was away on a business trip, she let investigators search the property. What they found, it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Scattered throughout the woods behind the house, they found bones. So many bones. They were hidden under leaves, buried in shallow graves, just everywhere. The investigators spent days combing through the 18-acre property. Every time they thought they'd found everything, they'd discover more. It was like this horrible puzzle that kept growing. The bones were scattered so widely that they had to bring in archaeology students to help map out where everything was found. And you know what made it even creepier? Some of the bones were found right next to the swimming pool where the Baumeister kids used to play. Can you imagine? These poor kids had been swimming and playing, having no idea what was literally feet away from them. The whole thing was just devastating for everyone involved. As news of the discoveries at Fox Hollow Farm began spreading, Herb Baumeister was nowhere to be found. He'd taken off in his car, heading to Canada. The police were closing in, and he knew it. On July 3rd, 1996, they found him, what was left of him. He'd driven to Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario and taken his own life. He left a suicide note, but here's the thing. It didn't mention anything about the murders, just complained about his failed marriage and business problems. Can you believe that? Back at the farm, the body count kept rising. The investigators eventually found more than 5,000 human bone fragments. It took months to process everything, and in the end, they were able to identify 11 victims. But you know what's really scary? They think there might have been more. Some estimates put the total number as high as 20 men who disappeared during Baumeister's killing spree. The impact on Indianapolis was... well, it was huge, especially in the gay community. All these men who just vanished over the years, now they knew why. Their families finally had answers, but the answers were just horrible. And think about the Baumeister family, Julie and the kids. Their whole life had been this lie. Their beautiful home, this place where they made memories, it was actually a killing ground. Fox Hollow Farm became this dark landmark. People would drive by just to look at it, you know? The new owners had trouble with trespassers, ghost hunters, true crime enthusiasts, all wanting to see the place where such horrible things happened. I mean, how do you move on from something like that? The community tried to heal, but some wounds just don't close completely. The scariest part, Herb Baumeister seems so normal. He ran a successful business, had a family, lived in this fancy house. It just shows you never really know what's happening behind closed doors. The case changed how Indianapolis police handled missing persons cases, especially in the LGBTQ community. But for many people, it was too little, too late. The damage was already done. The Herb Baumeister case is just... it's one of those stories that keeps you up at night, you know? Like, here was this guy who seemed to have it all: the perfect family, successful business, beautiful home. But behind that picture-perfect facade was something so dark, so twisted. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, and what really gets to me is thinking about all those victims, all those lives cut short. These were someone's sons, brothers, friends, people who just went out one night and never came home. Their families spent years wondering, hoping, searching, only to find out the truth in the most horrific way possible. You know, I think cases like this remind us why we need to keep telling these stories, not for the shock value, but because they matter. They remind us to look out for each other, to take missing persons reports seriously, and to remember that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. Before I go, I just want to thank you all for tuning in to this second episode of Crime Intelligence. Remember, we're here every single day with new true crime stories. Make sure to follow us so you don't miss any episodes. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you tomorrow.